Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our second Security Counselor Fireside Chat. Today's guest is Fiji Grande, former delegate of the North Pacific, current Security Counselor, and founder of the Ministry of Radio. Welcome to the show, Fiji.
Thank you so much for the kind welcome. Glad to be here.
All right. First thing we're going to go into the Security Council. We know from being in the region that a Security Council has a role within the vice delegacy, doing vice delegate checks and putting forth their opinions on those. And we also know that as a keeper, we need to endorse them. In your words, what is the role of a security counselor?
In my opinion, I would say that the role of the Security Council is to monitor regional security and defend our democracy from threats, um, and to enforce the removal of a rogue delegate should that be necessary.
How how does the Security Council look for rogue delicacies? What makes a delicacy rogue?
So, if you look at the regional constitution, um, essentially there's a section under the Security Council or duties and responsibilities that states that the Security Council is mandated with enforcing the removal of a delegate should that delegate be voted out by the regional assembly. So if there's a recall, or in the case of a regional election, when uh, there's a delegacy election and someone else is elected delegate, we're looking for cooperation on the part of that delegate to transition from power. That typically means, first and foremost, an immediate stop to endotarding, um, followed by participation in campaigns to boost support for the new delegate, whoever that might be. And if we don't see that, then things start to get more serious on our side, and we start to consider the possibility that the delegacy may be rogue. And that's not even looking at if there are harsher signs wherein the Constitution isn't being followed, or um, there's appointments of officers who are banjecting natives or something to that nature, in which case we have to be able to step in and be prepared for that sort of a situation.
So why would the Security Council step in and not the court?
So the Security Council is essentially designed to act on the behalf of the regional assembly. The regional assembly are the people who vote out uh, the delegate in the case of a recall, or who vote in some new delegate in the case of a standard delegacy election. And so all we're doing is upholding the voice of the regional assembly. The court, the court's role is in deciding what the punishment is for a rogue delegate, and that's not our position or our duty. We're only in place in order to defend our democracy on behalf of the regional assembly.
What was the most recent instance of a rogue delegate in the North Pacific?
So we've been very fortunate in that rogue delegacies have been pretty rare within the North Pacific. In my entire time within the North Pacific, we have not had such an instance, and I personally do not recall the last time that it happened.
So, with the importance of the Security Council within regional security and the need for them, the citizen, to endorse the Security Council, do you think the Security Council should take more of an active role in teaching citizens about regional security and why their endorsements matter?
I think that the regional handbook contains all the resources new citizens need to understand the importance of endorsements to regional security, particularly on the WADP, Keeper of the North, and Security Counselor dispatch pages. I would say that we continue to foster an encouraging environment by providing substantial rewards for citizens who maintain high endorsement levels and have a vocal staff of game side advocates to promote these resources to newcomers. I would say that as a general rule, I would encourage all security counselors to be more active on game side to promote the education of why regional security matters, why their endorsements matter, and how our job as security counselors play into regional security. But ultimately, I think those resources are already in place. If anything, we could just be more vocal about them.
Okay. So, what has been your biggest challenge as a security counselor?
Myself as a security counselor or as the security council as a whole?
A little bit of both. I'm sure that the Security Council as a whole faces issues, and I'm sure you individually have faced some sort of challenge.
I think the biggest challenge that I faced personally as a security counselor would have been pretty soon after my entry into the security council. I found that I had to actually learn a little bit about how endotarding worked, and that might sound pretty surprising because I was already really, top 15 in the region or something at endotarding when I became a member of the council. But ultimately, what I found was I was pretty immediately after becoming a member, quite concerned about members surpassing the vice delegate in number. Um, Coming, 20 or 30 below the vice delegate might be something to be concerned about as a security counselor. But as I became more experienced, I found that getting 20 to 30 endorsements when you're down at like a level of like 200 endorsements or something is super easy. It can happen overnight. But as you get higher and higher and higher, especially in the 900s, it's almost impossible to make up that difference in a short period of time. So there's almost no threat in that sort of a sense, and I had to become accustomed to that. Um, that's not to say that it's not something that we're looking out for or monitoring. It's more just something that it's not nearly as big a deal as most people typically think of. So that's my personal experience. I would say that the biggest challenge facing the Security Council right now, though, at least in my opinion, as a whole, is public credibility. The Security Council honestly has a pretty poor record when it comes to communication with the public and has faced criticism to become more transparent as a result. So, while some privacy is needed to maintain regional security, it is paramount that we maintain good relations with the public as a whole. And that's something that we're trying to combat right now.
All right, that leads me to my next question here. We've seen on the forums that the Security Council is making attempts to become more transparent in some of its activities. How do you balance the need for secrecy in some matters versus the public's need to know?
I missed that last bit you cut off.
How do you
Versus
balance
what?
the need for secrecy in some matters versus the public's need to know?
I would say it is vital that the Security Council remain apolitical, as the decisions that we make are made for the good of the community rather than to serve personal interests. And as such, it's important that the Security Council provide chambers where members can be fully honest about their opinions on important issues. It is important to respect that privacy. But as you mentioned in your question, there must be some balance. For the public to respect the Security Council as an institution, they must respect our activity and decisions and have faith in our ability to act in times of crisis. So, yes, there definitely has to be a balance.
So, one of the things that have come up is the Security Council, in its role as a protector of our democracy, served as a sort of rallying point for the region in the case of a rogue delicacy. We look to follow the security counselors. And one of the concerns the public has had is that the security counselors aren't necessarily visible to all aspects of our community. Nessie's visible on the regional message board, not so much in the forums or on Discord. Um, in your opinion, how can individual security council members become more visible to more aspects of our community?
So, so this actually sort of goes off of your previous question a little bit. Your previous question was, does there need to be a balance? But I didn't really discuss how that balance can exist. So I definitely think that there needs to be some increase in transparency within a security council. And I think that individual security council members need to be more responsible or at least responsive to the public on certain issues. So, my approach to increase security council transparency would be first and foremost to hold the wide majority of our conversations in the public council chambers. Many of these conversations involve relatively mundane topics such as changes to procedure or improving recruitment or finding new ways to utilize NS cards to promote activity. And holding these discussions in the public would improve knowledge of our affairs as well as allow public commentary and input. Um, my approach to discussions relating to regional security and whatnot that are kept private would be to formally establish a set of guidelines on how information can be released. And I think it's important that the Security Council show unity on sensitive matters or issues of significant importance or controversy in order to avoid becoming politicized in the public eye. So, in my public credibility thread in the council chambers, I think the guidelines outlined by Ghost represent the best balance between the need for privacy and the need for trust. But in addition to that, individual members can become more active on each of our different platforms, whether that be on the forums, on the regional message board, on Discord, and so on and so forth. Let me think for a second as to how I think that would best work.
Take your time.
I would say that that's actually one of the more surprising things that I found about the Security Council. And that goes back to your first question about, things that I found were challenging as I became a new member. And that would be that uh, each basically there's some lack of internal standards for activity, and it's something that I think that we can improve on. Each security counselor is responsible for setting the standard for and keeping their own activity and community involvement up. In my case, what that means is daily endorsing or endotarding, whatever the case may be in the situation, continued participation in the executive staff, providing assistance to newcomers, posting periodically on the regional message board, and joining VCs in the RP server. And like, while I definitely enjoy these activities, I see them as essential to maintaining our readiness and community trust. And I think that other security counselors would be wise in following my lead on that. You know, staying active in the executive staff, being welcoming to people who drop by, trying to provide assistance in other ways besides just maintaining regional security, because ultimately at the end of the day, having a wider and more substantial community presence improves our readiness when instability occurs. Did that answer your question? I know it was a really long,
It,
rambling sort of.
it sure did, and it leads me to another question. You talked about reaching out to these communities in that answer, and we've seen recently a security counselor retire from the council. So, does reaching out help the security council discover and train the next generation of counselors?
I don't really consider uh, helping discover and training the next generation of security counselors a key responsibility of the Security Council. We haven't really reached a point where we have an urgent need for new counselors. And as far as training goes, candidates that have substantial experience within the executive staff typically have some knowledge of regional security. So I think if anything, having security counselors be more present and active in our community will only improve public outreach and education efforts that sure could improve the knowledge of how regional security works, the mechanisms behind it, and how the important work we do plays into that. And insofar as that is concerned, sure, that'll help discover new people and train them. But I don't see that as one of our key responsibilities. That would only be sort of like a side effect of being more uh, positive and entrenched within our community in terms of activity.
So we talked about the executive staff and how some of those roles may help people in their quest should they decide to go to the Security Council. We talked about how rogue delicacies are one of the main things the Security Council takes care of, and how the court's responsibility is to punish a rogue delegate should they have broken the law. With the recent passing of the Agora Act and the dissolution of the Attorney General's office, how do you think that the lack of a designated prosecutor would affect your ability as a security council to bring a rogue delicacy to an end?
I don't think that a lack of an attorney general would impact our ability whatsoever. As I mentioned earlier, it's not the role for us to determine the consequences for rogue delegates. We only act in the public interest based on the mandate of the Regional Assembly and our Constitution to remain a democracy. So, in the case of a rogue delegacy, we would act as a council to bring that delegacy down, to install a temporary delegate until the Regional Assembly can find uh, or could have a special election to bring a new delegate to power. And in the aftermath of the end of that coup, we would uh, then act to serve the public as best as we could with public statements and whatnot. Um, as far as the Agora Act and a lack of a prosecutor goes, that would then be in the hands of uh, the next executive, and it would be their job and the court's job to handle those matters. That's not really something that the Security Council, at least in my mind, would dabble with, and it's not something that would affect us. Our job is to the Regional Assembly, not to the AG.
We recently saw a very poor attempt to infiltrate and overthrow the government by the CCD. Um, Besides their obvious lack of skill, what do you think is the greatest threat to TMP at the moment? Is it internal, external, or something else?
I think the greatest threat to the North Pacific currently remains an internal regional delegacy coup. Thing will pretty much only happen at the end of uh, two delegacy terms or one delegacy term, because at that point the delegate not exactly new to the position and has had the time to build up a substantial lead on endorsements and influence, which would help them to try to retain power in the aftermath. Uh, the thing is that the Security Council is very well positioned to counter exactly that kind of a threat because it's what we're designed to uh, counter. Um, as you may have seen in the East Pacific when Fedele did his attempted coup, that didn't exactly go very well for him, especially because outside actors, including our North Pacific Army, were able to step in and provide assistance. That's something that is something that would probably play in here in the North Pacific were something here to happen as well, because one of our jobs as security counselors is to provide that coordination across the region, and it's why our role uh, mandates that we be so active in our community, because we need to have the trust to provide a coordinated response. Specifically regarding CCD and their weak attempt to infiltrate us, I would say that we're basically the gatekeepers of the community when it comes to the vice delegacy having their check on new citizens coming in. And so we're definitely monitoring this sort of a thing. But the problem is that we typically, if it's not a known nation, aren't necessarily going to catch something like that. Um, and so it then becomes, a concern of, well, they're probably not a very skilled nation if it's, CCD. They're probably not going to rise very far in the ranks. And if they do, I mean, that's ultimately part of the regional assembly's responsibility. If the RA and the public decide in an election to elect them to office, there's really nothing that we can do unless they at some point go rogue and disobey the Constitution or uh, do not follow a transition. So, as far as biggest threat, I would say internal coup. As far as CCD being a threat, I would say it's minimal at best.
Is there anything you think the executive and the RA could do to better support the Security Council in its task?
In what?
In its task.
So, I definitely think that the Security Council has a huge role in maintaining public trust. And I almost consider it a currency whereby, in times of immense regional instability, that the public, the delegacy, if the delegacy isn't rogue, um, and the RA have the faith that we are going to be able to counteract the threat and that they uh, respond to our requests for assistance in the case that we need it in countering such a threat. So, as much as the Security Council is making steps to become more transparent, more responsive to certain criticisms from our community, we would hope that in times of regional crisis, that we will come together as a region in unity and be able to counteract the threat because we can't do it alone.
All right, well, before we wrap this chat up, is there anything else you would like to say?
Um, I guess what I would say is the North Pacific is the single largest and most powerful GCR in nation states, whereby democracy is the standard and individual contributors are encouraged to participate and rewarded by doing so, and wherein extensive resources and a welcoming community exist to help you grow. I would say that the North Pacific is a gold mine of opportunity for newcomers seeking to become more involved in the region who are uh, ambitious or have talents that benefit us. And I would say that without a doubt, the North Pacific is the best region I have been a part of in my time on nation states. And it is one of the greatest honors to have served and to continue to serve as a security counselor in this fine region.
All right, well, we thank you for coming onto the show and participating. We look forward to seeing more of you around the region. For those of you listening, thanks for joining us today and asking questions. This kind of shows will not work without your help. We will wrap up this show now and appreciate y'all for coming. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.